Hi, and welcome to another episode of Hackers Misadventures and Scale Modeling Feature Fridays. Now, one of the aircraft I would like to build is a P-47 in 30-second scale, and possibly in 70-second scale. But what came before the P-47? Well, that was the P-35. Now, I have a video here that talks about the history of the Seversky and Republican and the P-35. Now, I'm going to do one video on the P-35. I'm going to see if I can dig up a P-43 video too. But what came after the P-47? I'm not talking about the F-84 Thunderjet. I'm talking about still P-47, but what came after the standard combat model. So I'm going to do a video on that one. Just for something different, because everybody does P-47s. Let's do before and after aircraft. Now, there's several models of the P-35. There's a special hobbies kit in 1/72nd scale, and I believe there's a rear planes vacuum form version in 1/72nd scale. Now, in 1/48th, there's the Hobbycraft / Academy kit. In 1/48th scale, and there's also a door or wing kit. I think I'll be posting these pictures of these kits up, and Wolfpack is doing one in 1/48th. And the only 1/32nd scale P-35 is by the Williams brothers. It lacks interior, but it's basically accurate. That's the one I'm going to build it, but I got to find some line drawings in that so I can use my cutter to cut out the interior parts and that. So and that's it for what there is for models. I'll post the pictures up and let you see. I have my coffee, and let's watch the video on the P-47, or sorry, the P-35. Okay, and off we go.
Before the Second World War, before such aircraft as the Bell P-39 Airacobra, the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and the North American P-51 Mustang, there were two aircraft that paved the way for monoplane fighter development in the United States. One was the Curtiss P-36, an aircraft already featured on this channel, and which was the direct precursor to the P-40. And the other pioneering monoplane fighter was the Seversky. The P-35 can trace its origins back to the SEB-3, which was the first aircraft developed by the recently formed Seversky Aircraft Company. Founded in 1931, it was in fact a revival of the Seversky Aero Corporation, which itself had been founded back in 1923. Now, that company had never actually produced an aircraft itself. Instead, they focused on manufacturing instruments and parts, and it had not been big enough to survive the Wall Street crash of 1929. The SEB-3 was the work of Alexander de Seversky, the company founder, and Alexander Kartveli, his chief designer. Seversky had a long association with aircraft. He'd served with the Imperial Russian Air Services in the First World War, becoming a flying ace with 13 victories, before fleeing to the States in 1918 to avoid the turmoil of the Revolution. Also hailing from Russia, Kartveli was a gifted engineer who had spent most of his professional life living in France, before emigrating to the United States in the late 1920s. His name might be familiar to some viewers of this channel, as Kartveli's list of aircraft designs includes things such as the P-43 Lancer, the P-47 Thunderbolt, the F-84 Thunderjet, the F-84F Thunderstreak, and the F-105 Thunder Chief, just to name a few. But those achievements were, for the moment at least, ahead of him. As far as debut aircraft went, the SEV-3 was quite impressive. It was an amphibious, three-seat, low-wing monoplane that, in a time when biplane amphibians were still the norm, represented a huge upgrade for its class. It was powered by a 420 horsepower Wright J6 Whirlwind, and this, along with its sleek all-metal design, allowed Seversky himself to set a new world speed record for the type of 179.7 miles an hour, which was around 289 kilometers an hour. Its performance was good enough that Seversky believed it could easily compete for military contracts. With this in mind, the floats were removed and a pair of fixed main landing gears with aerodynamic spats were installed instead. Redesignated as the SEV-3 XAR, it was then sent to Wright Field to compete in a competition for a new general training aircraft for the Army Air Corps. In 1935 it won the competition and became the first all-metal, low-wing monoplane trainer selected for US service. Production models were known as the BT-8, and Seversky would end up producing around 30 for the Army Air Corps. In general, it was well liked by Army pilots. It was sturdy, reliable, and was easy to take off and land. However, there was one glaring issue, and that was it was woefully underpowered. This wasn't a result of the design itself, but an Army mandate that all training aircraft should have an engine of no more than 400 horsepower. As such, the BT-8 had been re-engined with a Pratt & Whitney Wasp Junior. To prove that the airframe would be perfectly viable with a much more powerful engine, Seversky modified the original SEV once again. A Wright R-1820 Cyclone was installed, rated at around 750 horsepower, and the floats were also reinstalled as well. Alexander Seversky himself then took it upon himself to set yet another world speed record, this time clocking in at 230.4 miles an hour, which was around 370 kilometers an hour, in September of 1935. Unfortunately, an upgraded version of the Seversky BT-8 would not be produced. By the time the BT-8s were entering service in 1936, the prototype for what would become the North American BT-9 had already flown. This aircraft, the forerunner to the famous T-6 Texan, would quickly go on to replace the BT-8 in the latter parts of the 1930s. However, buoyed by the improved performance of the SEV-3, Seversky built a second aircraft, specifically to enter in a new pursuit fighter competition that had been opened by the Army in 1935. The SEV-2 XP was basically a land-plane version of the upgraded SEV-3 with a fixed landing gear. It inherited the aerodynamic spats from the SEV-3 land plane, and it mounted 3 machine guns, a 50 caliber and a 30 caliber weapon in the nose, and a 30 caliber in the rear for defense as well. Built as a two-man aircraft in a time when the single cockpit fighter was the norm, and not looking like the sleekest aircraft around either, it was perhaps a little strange that Seversky felt confident of winning the upcoming competition. Luckily for Seversky, the prototype aircraft was damaged en route to the proving ground at Wright Field. I say luckily because, during this time, Curtiss-Wright had unveiled their prototype for the Model 75 Hawk, which would have completely dominated Seversky's entry in the competition and led to some serious embarrassment. Owing to the damaged prototype, the competition was delayed, allowing Seversky and Kartveli to carry out repairs. They also carried out an extensive redesign, having now seen what the competition actually was. Retaining the wing and engine, the fuselage was modified to have a single-seat cockpit with a razorback spine, something that would become a bit of a hallmark for Kartveli designs moving forward. And the fixed landing gear was replaced by a rearward retracting landing gear, with fairings that completely enclosed the mechanism and wheels. This not only dramatically improved the streamlining of the aircraft, but it would also act as a slight buffer in a wheels-up landing, with the fairings taking the worst of the impact before the fuselage made contact with the ground. With said modifications made, the aircraft was redesignated yet again as the SEV-1XP, and it returned to Wright Field to take part in the competition in late 1935. Curtiss Wright then immediately complained that the Seversky model had been improved upon, rather than just repaired, and they demanded that the competition be delayed again so that they could make modifications to their prototype as well. Fast forward to early 1936, and both sides had finally stopped complaining for long enough that the Army could actually get on with things, and then the Army immediately complicated matters by stipulating a change in power plant. One of the conditions of the competition had been a top speed in excess of 300 miles an hour, and thus far neither aircraft had achieved this. One problem had been reliability issues with the early versions of the Wright Cyclone, which were failing to produce their advertised horsepower, and the Army pushed for a change to the Pratt & Whitney R1830 Twin Wasp, which promised to deliver upwards of 850 horsepower. This turned out to be something of an exercise in futility, as it turned out, the engine barely managed to produce 750 horsepower on a good day, rather than 850, and during the final tests of the competition, the Seversky prototype only achieved a top speed of 277 miles an hour.
Just remember, a lot of these early engines that became reliable were unreliable because of teething problems. But as time went on, they solved a lot of the problems, generally.
Which was over 10 miles an hour slower than when it was running with the Wright Cyclone engine instead. That being said, the Curtiss prototype was faring even worse with the engine change, and although the top speed requirement wasn't met by either aircraft, Seversky was awarded a contract to produce 77 fighters as the P-35. The production P-35 differed from the prototype in a number of ways. Firstly, it had a more powerful engine, the 950 horsepower R1830-9 version of the Twin Wasp, a version that actually produced its advertised horsepower for a change. The carburetor intake was moved from the upper cowling to a position on the side of the fuselage where it met with the wing. The landing gear fairings were reduced in coverage to save weight, although they were still useful in a wheels-up landing situation. The shotgun shell starting system was replaced with an all-electric starter, and the bulged canopy was replaced with a more streamlined design. Following these changes, the specifications of the P-35 were as follows. The wingspan was of 36 feet, or around 11 meters. It had a length of 25 feet 2 inches, or 7.7 meters, and a height of 9 feet 1 inch, or 2.76 meters. It had a maximum weight of around 5,600 pounds, or 2.5 tons, and it had a slightly improved top speed of 281 miles an hour, or around 452 kilometers an hour. The armament remained the same, one 30 caliber gun and one 50 caliber gun being in the nose, but a standout feature of the P-35 was its deeply impressive range of over 1,100 miles. This was thanks to the innovative use of a so-called wet wing, which represented a fair amount of foresight on the part of Alexander Kartveli. The entire inner structure of the wing was coated with a special sealant, which made the entire thing into a large single fuel tank, which gave the P-35 a very long range. US aerial doctrine at the time didn't put the greatest emphasis on range, as most fighter aircraft were designed to be used for coastal defense, rather than, things like the long-range escort or intercept missions you'd be seeing in the Second World War.
That's because they didn't foresee that. They should have, because one of my previous videos on the Gotha bomber and the Streichen, they were doing long-range bombings. So when the German bombers were over London, they were attacked by Southwest Camels and the like, and there was no fighter escort. They should have learned from those lessons, but they didn't. Typical military, anyways.
And there were also the vast distances of the Pacific to consider as well. and a lot of the time that wasn't really being factored into a fighter design in the US, especially with the Army Air Corps. The Navy had it considered a bit more, but for the Army, this was a considerable departure to have an aircraft with such a long range. But because of the Army's sort of doctrinal thinking at the time, the superior range of the P-35 was not as appreciated at the time as what it could have been, though this may have also something to do with the fact that the wet wing was a complete nightmare from the point of maintenance. The sealant in the wing dried out rather quickly, which resulted in minor and then not so minor fuel leaks. This meant that the wing had to be disassembled at regular intervals to get at the problem, lest the P-35 become a flying sieve, and this was a time-consuming and very costly addition to the aircraft's regular maintenance cycle. Putting aside the proclivity to distribute aviation fuel across various parts of the US mainland, the Caribbean and Pacific waters, when it entered service in 1937, the P-35 was the first fighter aircraft in the US to incorporate all of the modern features that would soon become the norm in a fighter in World War II. A cantilever monoplane wing, all-metal construction, a fully enclosed cockpit, and a retractable main landing gear. In essence, it was a huge upgrade when compared to anything else that had come before, and indeed, the most modern fighter in the frontline service at the time was the Boeing P-26P shooter, which featured a fixed landing gear, an open cockpit, and externally braced wings. The first squadrons to receive the P-35 were those of the 1st Pursuit Group, which were based at Selfridge Field in Michigan. It was an easy aircraft to learn.
Even though it's a Saturday, they're still working downstairs because they're putting in classrooms in the empty space below me on the ground floor. And I'm not sure if university or college, one of the two, but anyways, they got to have it done before our school opens after the Labor Days on September 4th. First day of school is supposed to be the 5th, I guess. Anyways, so sorry about the noise that you hear, something occasionally.
Being rugged and quite forgiving on rough landings, but in general it did not earn a particularly good reputation with the US pilots. It was often viewed as being underpowered, and the constant fuel leaks from the wet wing made it public enemy number one for most of the squadron's ground crews. This, and the fact that delivery of all 77 aircraft took well over a year to complete, contributed to the Air Corps placing a larger order for the Curtiss P-36 Hawk, the aircraft that the P-35 had initially beaten out in the competition. However, another contributing factor may have been Alexander Seversky's poor political/business decisions. In parallel with the P-35, a two-seat version known as the A-12, or 2PA, or A-8V1, depending on which exact model and country you're looking at, had been developed. There is a bit of a debate as to whether this was developed from the original two-seat fighter prototype, the SEV-XP2, or if this was a separate two-seat model. But either way, ostensibly it was designed as a light bomber. It only saw use as a trainer within the Air Corps, but it did receive some foreign interest. Now this foreign interest included the somewhat under-the-counter sale of 20 of these aircraft to Imperial Japan in 1937, which, considering the political climate of the time, rather annoyed several prominent people within the US military and various government offices. Funny that. This meant that for a time, both America and Japan would essentially field one version or another of the P-35 in their air units. However, the Japanese would not use them in a combat role by the time they were at war in the Pacific. They did see some action in the Sino-Japanese conflict, but by the time of Pearl Harbor they had been relegated as training aircraft. But getting back to Seversky, as a result of that sale and a slew of whole other things, no further orders for the P-35 were forthcoming, and following the Air Corps' expansion program in 1940, the P-35's in-service were simply split across the various pursuit groups to plug gaps until better fighters could be delivered. This would either come in the form of the improved variants of the P-36, which didn't suffer from their earlier self-immolating exhaust problems, or, more hopefully, the shiny new Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. Now this left Seversky and the company in a bit of an embarrassing position, for they had invested a lot of money in the P-35 and their production lines, and they suddenly had very little to show for it. Additionally, the company was also in a fair amount of debt owing to production costs, and Seversky's gallivanting around the country building racing models of the P-35, which were great for publicity but didn't really earn them much in the way of money. Thankfully, two things came to the rescue: Sweden, and then an internal business/hostile takeover. In 1939, with the imminent threat of war looming, the Swedish Air Force was looking to overseas aircraft suppliers to help modernise its inventory. Their own domestic production of aircraft was slowly getting up to speed, but Saab had yet gotten to the point where it could build true fighters on its own, and so one of the big things Sweden was looking for was a modern fighter to replace the biplanes that they were currently fielding. One of the many aircraft that took Swedish attention was the Seversky P-35. Alexander Seversky immediately jumped on the opportunity, and he took personal charge of the effort to secure the Swedish order, and this involved producing a more powerful and updated version of the P-35. Now, in the previous 2 years, Seversky had pursued a fairly successful racing program, building multiple fast aircraft based on the P-35 airframe. Didn't always make them a lot of money, but from the standpoint of speed, performance and racing, they were successful. During this time, several experimental aircraft were also produced, such as the AP-1, the AP-4, and the AP-7, with the letters standing for Army Pursuit, though, with the exception of the AP-4, little attention was actually paid to them by the Army at all. The AP-7 was used by female aviator Jackie Cochran to set several new records, including one for 320 miles an hour over a 2,000-mile circuit, and it was this aircraft that became the basis for the new P-35A. Known internally as the EP-168, with the EP standing for Export Pursuit, the aircraft had a slightly lengthened fuselage, a longer air scoop, and it had an improved armament. It had two 30 caliber machine guns in the nose, and two 50 caliber machine guns mounted in the wings. To deal with the added weight, the aircraft also came with a beefed up version of the Twin Wasp, which now put out around 1200 horsepower. Aside from the longer fuselage, these aircraft were easily identified by the fairings installed underneath the wing-mounted machine guns. The wings themselves were too thin to safely catch the spent bullet casings, owing to the wet wing fuel tank style, so a streamlined compartment had to be installed underneath. Sweden placed an initial order for 15 aircraft on the 29th of June 1939, and this was quickly followed by another for 45 aircraft in October, and then one more for a further 60 aircraft in January of 1940. However, by this point there had been a big change. Sweden was no longer receiving Seversky aircraft, they were instead receiving those from the newly renamed Republic Aviation Corporation. A combination of financial loss and political intrigue, a topic of which is beyond the scope of this video, had led to a major restructure of the company, and Alexander Seversky had been forced out of the company he had founded, and the name change was part of an attempt to fix partially burned bridges with the US government. Deliveries
Makes you wonder what happened to him afterwards. I'll have to look it up.
Of the Republic aircraft began in early 1940, receiving the Swedish designation of J9. By mid-1940, the first 60 of these had been delivered, coming by sea to Trondheim in Norway, and then completing the rest of the journey by rail, but the second batch of aircraft would never make it across the Atlantic. With the ever-increasing prospect of the United States being dragged into a war in Europe, the War Department had impressed a number of aircraft on the production lines that had been purchased by other nations, and the Swedish P-35s were one of their victims. The J9s that had made it across to Sweden would go on to lead relatively long service lives. Indeed, they served the longest out of all the P-35s that were actually built. Defending Sweden's neutrality, the J9s flew throughout the Second World War, often intercepting Allied bombers that had been forced to flee across into Swedish airspace after sustaining damage over Germany. They remained in frontline service for a long time, being frontline fighter aircraft until 1947, and several were still in use in the mid-1950s, including 2 that were often flown by air staff on inspection tours. In fact, 2 of the surviving 4 P-35s are from the Swedish order, one of which can be found in Sweden itself, and the other one is currently under restoration in Florida. Back over in the United States, the remaining P-35As that were on the production line were rapidly placed into service throughout 1940 and early 1941. Though they were being thoroughly outclassed by emerging designs such as the Lockheed P-38, the Bell P-39, and of course the Curtiss P-40, these newer models were not always available in sufficient numbers for the rapidly expanding air groups of the Army Air Corps at the time. This was especially true for the more remote air units, particularly those based in the Philippines, who were in desperate need of more modern fighters. The need was in fact so urgent that 45 P-35s were taken straight off the production line as is and sent across the Pacific to the Philippines. They arrived there with Swedish insignia, Swedish flight manuals, and metric flying instruments, none of which made them particularly easy to adjust to, and it took a considerable amount of time for everything to be put back to normal. Initially, these P-35s were assigned to all of the squadrons within the 24th Pursuit Group that was based at Clark Air Base. Along with Curtiss P-36s, and even a number of older P-26P shooters, they formed the bulk of the Philippines' air defences in the lead up to the Pacific War. Now, by the time of December the 8th itself had actually come around in 1941, newer P-40 Warhawks were arriving, but a large number of the P-35As still equipped the 34th Pursuit Squadron, which was based at Carman Field. It was these aircraft that would make the type's combat debut, if you could call the loss of 12 P-35s on the ground as such a thing, but other P-35s were soon in the air for the frantic and desperate defense against the Japanese onslaught. As with the Curtiss P-36 and early models of the P-40s, the P-35s suffered due to a lack of effective protection. They possessed no armour for the pilot whatsoever, and the fuel tanks were not self-sealing. Indeed, some of the P-35s were already quite worn out, and the wet wings apparently leaked abominably by this point, with at least one aircraft being lost to a mid-air fire as the leaking fuel was literally ignited by either gunfire or simply the hot exhaust of the aircraft's engine. Now, depending on what source material you read, the P-35 may have shot down 2 Mitsubishi A6M0s. However, kill claims for this early chaotic part of the war are very difficult to substantiate. The 2 claimed kills against Zeros were made by Lieutenants Stuart Robb and Ben Brown, both flying with the 34th Pursuit Squadron. But even if both of those victories did in fact take place, they would have been an anomaly in an otherwise grim situation for the P-35s in the Philippines.
Yeah, a couple of Philippine Air Force pilots flying P-26 managed to knock down a couple of Zeros before they were knocked out. Those guys were really brave. That's why I'm going to do P-26 at some point, just so that you guys can hear the story, if I can find one with the story.
By the 10th of December, just 2 days into the fighting, their numbers had dwindled from 45 airframes down to just 16. These were then thrown into the attack on the oncoming Japanese invasion fleet, where one P-35, flown by Lieutenant Sam Morritt, repeatedly strafed and eventually sank the Japanese minesweeper W-10, making it the type's only naval kill. Unfortunately, Morritt himself would be killed in the attempt, as when the minesweeper went up, the explosion was that powerful and the aircraft was that low that the shockwave literally tore one of the wings off and his P-35 was seen plummeting into the sea. Following the attack on the invasion fleet, more ill fortune soon followed. The same group of fighters that had gone out for the attack was caught by another wave of Japanese aircraft as they returned to their airbase in the afternoon to rearm and refuel. The result was 12 more P-35s being destroyed and a further 6 were damaged. By the 24th of December, just 6 P-35s were still operational in the area, and they were then ordered to pull back to Bataan Field on the 6th of January 1942. In a cruel sense of irony, they were then mistaken for Japanese aircraft by the understandably anxious and somewhat trigger-happy US anti-aircraft gunners defending the airfield, and at least 2 of those 6 P-35s were brought down or written off by friendly fire. The last actual combat sortie flown by the P-35 involved the last remaining aircraft on the 3rd of May, when Captain Ramon Zosa of the Philippine Army Air Corps carried out a strafing attack on the Japanese landings. Following this, he landed the aircraft in a small jungle airstrip, and the P-35's brief and bloody combat life came to a sudden end. Though all...
The thing is that, according to legend, or myth, or whatever you call it, that P-35 was supposed to have survived. They had the foresight to hide it, but when they came back to get it, it was gone. So nobody knows really what happens to it. There's no Japanese record of it being captured and tested or anything like that. So what happened to it? To this day, nobody's found any evidence of it anywhere. Would they find it someday? Probably not. But stranger things have happened. But I just throw that little tidbit in there for you.
All of the P-35s in the Philippines had been wiped out. It's important to note that a vast majority of them were actually brought down either by Japanese, or unfortunately friendly, ground fire. Only a small number were actually lost in air-to-air combat, so assessing its capabilities as a frontline fighter leaves a lot for interpretation. However, it was plain enough that it was simply no match for the opposition. Like many designs of its time, the P-35 was innovative one year and then almost totally obsolete the next, with fatal consequences for the men that would go on to fly it. That being said, aside from the issues with the wet wing, the P-35 itself wasn't necessarily a bad aircraft. It handled well, and the rest of it was easy to maintain, aside from the wet wing. It just wasn't good enough by the time that it got a chance for real action. This obsolescence had long been anticipated as far back as 1939, and steps had been taken to improve upon the design, and this had resulted in several experimental aircraft designs, 2 of which are of particular note. The first was the XP-41. Now, the last P-35 off the production line was kept back and modified, being equipped with a 1200 horsepower twin Wasp engine with a new 2-stage supercharger. The supercharger was mounted in a ventral position under the fuselage, and the landing gear now retracted inward rather than rearward. This aircraft flew for the first time in March of 1939, and it set a top speed of 323 miles an hour. However, development of the XP-41 would quickly stop due to the development of another prototype. This second aircraft came with an even more potent engine, the Pratt & Whitney 1830-25. Now, this aircraft produced the same horsepower as the XP-41, but it came with a turbo supercharger. This allowed it to perform much better at higher altitudes, and although this new fighter was heavier, it was in fact faster, clocking in at 351 miles an hour on its demonstration flight.
You can see the outline of the P-47 on this aircraft. Though there was been modelers trying to model this one in 32nd scale, and they were trying to use the forward fuselage and wings of a P-47 and graft a P-35 tail on it, but it's too different to go that way. It's unfortunate that it's a good looking aircraft.
With these impressive performance figures in hand, it was entered into the 1939 fighter competition for the Army Air Corps, and it won. Seversky, soon to become Republic, was then given a contract to produce this fighter as the P-43 Lancer. But the story of a Lancer is one for another day.
Well, that is that. That was interesting. I'm going to see if I can find something on the P-43 Lancer. And like I said, I'm going to do one on what came after the P-47 and before the F-84. So I hope you enjoyed this, and please like and subscribe to my channel. And if you wish to donate to my channel, you can donate through either my Patreon page, or you can donate directly on this YouTube channel via PayPal. There's a little thing in the corner of my main page on the banner that you can tap on to make a donation to. And remember, every build's an adventure, so go make it awesome, and we'll see you later.